The cold didn't hit all at once. It crept in slowly like poison, starting at my toes and climbing upward with every minute I stood outside. I was barefoot, wearing nothing but an old sleep shirt and pajama pants thin as paper against the Minnesota winter night. Snow clung to my ankles, numb and colorless. My breath came out in frantic clouds, freezing before it left my lips. I had been out here for what felt like hours, but in reality it had only been 27 minutes. 27 minutes since my sister slammed the door in my face and turned the lock. "Cool off," she said, and then she walked away. I saw it through the frosted glass of our front door, her silhouette retreating into the warmth while I stood shaking, pounding, pleading. I screamed her name, first loud, then louder, then hoarse. My knuckles were raw from knocking. My voice cracked. My teeth chattered so violently I thought they'd shatter. I tried the handle again. Still locked. I rang the bell. Nothing. I stood there, clutching my arms, bouncing from foot to foot, trying to keep blood moving, trying not to cry, trying not to panic. The wind howled, whipping around the porch like it had something to prove. I pressed my forehead to the door frame, hoping she'd see me, pity me, let me in. I counted to 60, then again. But the door never opened. Then came the turning point, the moment I stopped hoping. I caught sight of her again, Rachel standing in the hallway inside, her arms crossed, watching me. Our eyes met. Her face held no anger, no regret, just a calm, blank cruelty I hadn't seen since we were kids. Then she smiled, just a small, satisfied curve of her mouth, and disappeared once more. The porch light flipped off. Darkness swallowed me whole. That was the moment something broke inside me. The cold wasn't just in my bones now, it was in my trust. I stumbled down the steps, snow crunching under my bare feet. My fingers were stiff, purpling. I walked around to the side of the house, tried the back door. Locked. The windows locked. I thought about breaking one, but I couldn't even feel my hands well enough to grip anything. I thought about screaming again, but my voice had turned to mist. My vision blurred. I knelt in the snow, more from weakness than choice. My skin screamed in silence. Frostbite, a voice whispered from somewhere in my memory. Exposure. Hypothermia. The air was so still it felt like I'd left the world entirely. The sky above me swirled gray and white snowflakes catching in my lashes, like tiny shards of glass. I pressed my hands into my armpits for warmth, curled into myself. The pain in my fingers had stopped, which scared me more than the pain itself. That meant nerves were shutting down. I thought about sleeping just for a second, just to escape the burning cold. But another thought shoved its way in. If I slept, I might not wake up, and if I didn't wake up, Rachel would win. That was when the anger came. It surged like fire through my frozen limbs. Anger was warm. Anger was survival. I crawled toward the side gate. It was iced over, but I kicked at it with the heel of my foot until it groaned open. I made it to the neighbor's porch and collapsed against the door. I didn't knock. I pounded. I didn't shout. I screamed. And when the porch light came on, when the door creaked open and Mr. Ellison's shocked face appeared, I fell forward into the warmth like a drowning woman breaking the surface. He called 911 before I could even speak. At the hospital, the nurse pulled off my socks, or what was left of them, and her breath caught. My toes were gray. My fingertips, too. Blisters had started forming on the pads of both hands. The ER doctor called it moderate frostbite with risk of tissue loss. He asked what happened. I told him the truth. My sister locked me outside. The nurse stopped writing. The doctor's pen paused. I saw it in their faces, that flicker of horror that said this wasn't just a bad night. This was abuse, and in that moment, shivering under fluorescent lights with IVs in my arms and heat packs on my skin, I made a silent promise. This time, I wouldn't stay quiet. This time, I'd take pictures. This time, there would be proof. The hospital room smelled like disinfectant and warmed plastic. I lay on a narrow bed wrapped in thermal blankets, my skin throbbing as it thawed. My fingers bandaged and swollen pulsed with dull pain. The ER doctor had explained it carefully, his voice clinical but grim. Some tissue damage. You'll need follow-up, possibly physical therapy. The fingertips may lose sensitivity permanently. We'll monitor for necrosis. That word stuck with me. Necrosis. Dead flesh. Not from disease or an accident, but from being left outside like trash. My sister hadn't just locked a door. She'd locked away my humanity. The nurse came in with a tablet and asked if I had any next of kin I wanted to contact. I said no. She raised an eyebrow, then asked what happened again. I told her the same story. My sister locked me out during a snowstorm. No, it wasn't a misunderstanding. No, I wasn't overreacting. And no, I wasn't going back to that house. Her pen paused midway through a sentence. I could see it she wanted to ask more, but she didn't. She just nodded and wrote something I couldn't see. After they released me, Amanda picked me up from the hospital. She didn't ask questions right away. She just drove hands gripping the wheel a little too tight. I sat beside her in borrowed clothes wrapped in a too-big coat, hands aching under gauze. She waited until we were halfway to her apartment before she finally said, "Rachel did this." I nodded. That was all it took. Amanda didn't gasp or lecture or suggest I try to make peace. She just whispered, "You need to document everything." That night, I sat at her kitchen table while she helped me unwrap the gauze slowly, gently. She took photos hands, feet, the reddened line across my wrist where I'd scraped it on the frozen porch railing. I flinched at every flash. It felt humiliating but necessary. I saw myself through the lens for the first time, damaged, yes, but undeniable. These weren't dramatics. This wasn't just a fight. This was evidence. The next day, Amanda drove me to urgent care for a second opinion. She said we needed more than just ER notes, we needed continuity. The doctor there confirmed the frostbite diagnosis and added further notes: second-degree injury to fingers, early signs of blistering, possible long-term damage. She printed copies for me without asking. "Do you feel safe going home?" she asked. I hesitated. She saw it. "That's a no," she answered for me. "Good. You shouldn't." That afternoon, Amanda helped me set up a folder, digital and physical, medical reports, photos, receipts, emails. Every scrap of proof that this happened, that it wasn't in my head, that I wasn't being dramatic as Rachel had always accused. I stared at the folder for hours, my body aching, my pride fractured. There was one picture in particular, a shot Amanda had taken of my right hand, curled in purple at the fingertips, skin mottled with frost. It didn't look like mine. It looked like someone else's suffering, but I remembered the burn of the cold, the way pain had turned to numbness, the way I couldn't even knock by the end. I remembered the smile on Rachel's face. That made it real. What hit me hardest wasn't just the physical pain, it was the recognition that it could have been worse, much worse. If Mr. Ellison hadn't opened the door, if I had collapsed outside instead of crawling to his house, if my body had shut down just a few minutes sooner, I could have lost fingers, toes, my life, and Rachel wouldn't have called for help. I knew that now with bone-deep certainty. She would have left me out there. She wanted to. That was the stake. That was the price of staying silent. I wasn't a victim of circumstance. I was the result of a pattern. Years of shrinking myself to keep the peace, of second-guessing my instincts, of swallowing every slight and insult until even my pain didn't feel valid anymore. But this was too big to bury. The pictures were ugly. The reports were clinical. But together, they told the truth. And the truth was Rachel had crossed a line. Not just morally, legally. And I was done paying the price for her temper. I didn't become her target overnight. Rachel had always been the center of everything. Growing up, she was the sun our household revolved around, and I was the shadow cast at her feet. Our mother, Margaret, adored her. That's not just a figure of speech, she worshipped her. If Rachel brought home a C on a math test, Mom would say the teacher was probably too harsh. If I brought home an A, I was met with a distracted nod and a question about whether I had remembered to feed the cat. Our father, Charles, worked long hours as a property manager, and when he came home, he mostly sat in silence reading the paper or watching the news. He didn't meddle. He didn't engage. If we fought, he called it girls being girls. If Rachel snapped at me, he told me to let it go. "You're the younger one," he'd say. "Be the bigger person." It was a phrase I heard so often it lost all meaning. I was always supposed to be the one who gave in, gave up, got over it. Rachel, on the other hand, was a force of nature, loud, charismatic, beautiful. She dominated every room she entered, and Mom encouraged it. She's got leadership potential, she'd say. What she had was control over the conversation, over the tone of the house, over me. When we were children, she'd steal my toys, my clothes, my diary, and laugh when I cried. Mom would say, "Don't be so sensitive, Emily. She's just teasing." But it wasn't teasing. It was psychological warfare with a Barbie doll in hand. It escalated slowly, the way all toxic dynamics do. By the time we were teenagers, Rachel had perfected the art of gaslighting. She'd say things like, "You always overreact," or "You're imagining things," whenever I confronted her about her behavior. I began to believe her. I questioned my own perceptions, my own emotions. If I cried, I was melodramatic. If I got angry, I was unstable. When Rachel was angry, though, the world stopped to accommodate her. Her tantrums were reframed as stress or pressure from school. Mine were dismissed as weakness. The summer I turned 16, she threw my journal out the window during an argument. I had written about a boy I liked. She read it aloud at dinner. When I told Mom how humiliating it was, she waved it off. Don't leave things lying around if you don't want them read. I learned then that privacy wasn't mine to have. When I left for college, I thought I had escaped. I didn't go far, just 2 hours away, but it felt like freedom. I flourished in ways I hadn't expected. I made friends, joined clubs, studied literature, and even laughed without looking over my shoulder. But Rachel still hovered, calling, texting, pulling me back into her orbit. When our father died, everything shifted again. He left the house to Mom, of course, and Rachel, who had just ended her second engagement, moved back in. I was already living in a small apartment on the other side of town, working at the local library. But when Mom had a minor fall and needed help during recovery, Rachel called me and said, "You'll move back in." I can't do this alone. It wasn't a question. It was an instruction. I resisted at first, offering to help hire a caregiver, but Mom chimed in, insisting it would be better for everyone if I came home. I caved. I always caved. Moving back into that house was like stepping into a trap I'd barely escaped once before. Rachel took over immediately. She decided what groceries we bought, what time we ate dinner, what TV shows we watched. She managed Mom's meds, scheduled appointments, and monitored everything I did. "You should be grateful," she said once when I complained. "I'm doing all the hard work. You're just here for show." But I cooked. I cleaned. I paid for prescriptions and drove Mom to her appointments when Rachel needed a break. Still, she acted like I was an intruder. I felt it in the way she spoke to me, sharp, dismissive, always laced with sarcasm. "You're still such a baby, Emily," she'd say, rolling her eyes, always whining. "Grow up." And Mom never stepped in. Not once. She sat through every insult, every put-down in silence. Sometimes I caught her watching me with something like regret in her eyes, but she never said a word. Silence in that house was just another form of loyalty. I started keeping track then, not just in my head, but on paper. Comments Rachel made, times she manipulated situations, the way Mom pretended not to hear. I didn't know yet what I'd use it for. I just knew I needed to stop forgetting. The cold that night didn't come out of nowhere. It was years in the making. It wasn't weather. It was a legacy. Living with Rachel again was like sharing space with a ticking time bomb. The calm never lasted, only stretched thin between minor detonations. At first, the arguments were small about how I folded laundry, how I stacked dishes, how I spoke to Mom. "You don't even sound respectful," she said once after I answered a simple question. "You talk to her like she's a burden." I blinked in disbelief. I had spent the entire day driving Mom to 2 appointments and cleaning out the medicine cabinet Rachel refused to touch. But the truth didn't matter in that house. Rachel created the reality, and everyone else was expected to live inside it. The tension mounted with every passing week. My room, once mine as a child, now felt like a cell. Rachel walked in without knocking, used my things, moved them around when she felt like it. One morning, I found the novel I had been reading lying face down in the sink, soaked. When I asked her why, she said, "Maybe if you stopped leaving crap everywhere, your stuff wouldn't get ruined." I hadn't left it in the sink. I knew that. But I also knew there was no use arguing. She thrived on conflict, on being the aggressor. The more upset I got, the more amused she became. Mom, meanwhile, existed in a fog of denial. When I brought up Rachel's behavior, she would sigh and say, "That's just how she is," or worse, "You know your sister's under a lot of stress." The burden of peacekeeping always fell to me. It always had. But this time, I was starting to feel the cracks. I was 32 years old, being policed like a teenager in my own home with no allies and no boundaries. Rachel's control tightened in ways that weren't physical but felt like a noose. She controlled the thermostat, the grocery lists, even the car keys. If I needed to go out, I had to ask. She didn't say no directly, she just made it so inconvenient that staying became the easier option. "You're just going to leave Mom alone while you run errands," she'd ask, eyebrows raised. "Do what you want, but don't say I didn't warn you if something happens." It wasn't concern, it was manipulation dressed in silk. One weekend, Amanda invited me to a book reading. I hadn't been out socially in over a month. I said yes. When I got dressed and came downstairs, Rachel looked me over and said, "Who's going to believe you're a librarian dressed like that?" I wore a sweater and jeans. Nothing provocative, nothing wild, but her voice sliced through me anyway. I left the house, but the guilt followed. That's what she was best at, making me doubt myself, apologize for existing. And when she wasn't cutting me down directly, she wielded Mom as her weapon. One night, I overheard her on the phone with a cousin saying, "I do everything here. Emily just shows up when it's convenient." You know how she is always fragile. I stood outside the door, fists clenched, throat tight. Fragile. That was her favorite word for me. It wasn't true, but it had power, because it made everyone question whether I could be trusted with my own pain. The boiling point came in a seemingly minor moment. Rachel asked to borrow money, not for bills, not for groceries, but for a new set of hair extensions. I said no, calmly, politely. She stared at me for a long time before laughing. "Wow," she said. "All these years under my roof and you can't even do one thing for me under her roof." That line stayed with me. I paid rent, I bought food, I did half the housework, but none of that mattered. In her mind, she owned the space, the story, and me. I went upstairs trembling with fury. And for the first time, I wrote everything down in a document titled, "If I Ever Forget." I listed every insult, every instance of control, every time Mom looked the other way. It wasn't a plan. Not yet. But it was a shift. A quiet refusal to let her erase the truth. Every word I typed felt like a rebellion. I wasn't ready to leave, but I was ready to stop pretending. The war wasn't coming. It had already begun. The night everything shattered began like any other quiet tense simmering beneath the surface. It was a Thursday in early January, the kind of night where the air outside felt heavy, like it carried a warning. I came home from the library after closing shift and found Rachel sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone feed on the coffee table, a half-empty wine glass in one hand. Mom was already in bed. The living room smelled like burnt microwave popcorn and Rachel's lavender perfume, a scent I had grown to hate. "You forgot to get more almond milk," she said without looking up. I hadn't. I just hadn't asked if she wanted any. I didn't respond. I walked past her into the kitchen and began putting away the groceries I'd picked up on the way home. I could feel her eyes on me, her silence louder than any insult. Then she spoke. "I saw Amanda's post. Must be nice having time to go out and play house with your little friends while I keep this one running." She meant the house. She meant Mom. She meant control. I didn't take the bait. I said I picked up your prescriptions, refilled the car's gas, and did the laundry. If that's playing house, maybe you should try it. Her head snapped up. That look. That sharp, narrowed, venomous stare that always came before the storm. "You've gotten really brave lately," she said, slowly standing. "Is that what Amanda's been feeding you? Some garbage about standing up for yourself?" My heart pounded, but I didn't move. "No," I said. "That's what therapy is for." I don't know why I said it. Maybe because I wanted her to know I was changing. Maybe because part of me wanted to see how far she would go, but I knew instantly I had said too much. Rachel's face darkened. "You're telling strangers about our family," she hissed. "That's low even for you." "It's not their business," I said. "It's mine. My pain. My story. And I'm tired of acting like it didn't happen." The room fell into silence. Rachel's jaw clenched. For a second, I thought she might scream. Instead, she set her glass down slowly, deliberately. "Get out," she said. I blinked. "What?" "You heard me. Get out of the house. Now." I looked at the clock. It was almost 10 p.m. Snow was falling heavily outside. "Rachel, don't be ridiculous." She stepped forward, her voice cold and clear. "You don't live here anymore." "I pay rent," I said, "and I live here as much as you do." "You want independence," she snapped. "Go be independent somewhere else." I turned to walk away, to go to my room to just end the conversation, but she was faster. She grabbed my arm, yanked me back, and shoved me toward the front door. I stumbled, hitting the wall, breath catching in my throat. She opened the door. The wind rushed in, sharp and merciless. Snow blew across the porch like smoke. "Go ahead," she said. "Prove how strong you are." I stared at her. For a split second, I thought she might change her mind, that maybe the cold would jolt her back to reason, but it didn't. Her eyes were flat, empty. I stepped backward, intending to get to my phone to call anyone, but she slammed the door before I could. The lock clicked. I banged on it. "Rachel, don't do this!" "No answer!" I shouted. I pounded. The porch light went off. Darkness again. My bare feet began to ache. The cold crawled up my legs, under my clothes, into my chest. Panic bloomed. Not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, deadly kind that told me this wasn't a game. She wasn't going to open the door. I wasn't being taught a lesson. I was being punished, and maybe even erased. I don't know how long I stayed out there before the numbness set in. Long enough to stop feeling my toes. Long enough to believe I might not get back inside. And the worst part wasn't the cold. It was the knowledge that she had planned it, that this moment had been building all along and I had walked right into it. The collapse wasn't sudden. It had been happening for years. That night, it just finally made a sound. The morning after the hospital, everything ached. My skin felt bruised from the inside out, and my fingers throbbed beneath layers of ointment and gauze. Amanda made scrambled eggs, but I couldn't eat more than 2 bites. My body was healing, but my mind was still frozen back on that porch, replaying Rachel's face behind the glass. I stared at my hands. The bandages reminded me of boxing gloves, except I hadn't fought back. I'd survived, but I hadn't fought. Not yet. Amanda brought her laptop to the table and opened a new folder. "You need to talk to someone," she said. I didn't answer. "I'm serious, Em. This isn't just trauma, it's criminal. We're not just going to document what happened. We're going to do something about it." I swallowed hard. "Who would believe me?" She turned the screen toward me. "This is the County Domestic Abuse Hotline. They have legal advocates and resources. You don't have to do this alone." My eyes burned. I hadn't cried at the hospital. I hadn't cried when I looked at the x-rays or when the doctor used the word permanent. But now, sitting in Amanda's kitchen with scrambled eggs turning cold on my plate and the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the room, the tears came. Not because I was scared, because I was done pretending I wasn't. That afternoon I made the call. I spoke to a woman named Camille who asked direct, calm questions about the incident. Her voice never wavered, not even when I described the moment the porch light shut off. She asked if I had photos. I said yes. Medical records, yes. Witnesses, possibly. She asked if I had somewhere safe to stay. I said I was staying with a friend temporarily. Camille paused. "What Rachel did is classified as intentional endangerment," she said. "And if you choose to file a report, this is something the courts will take seriously." The phrase, "if you choose," stuck in my head. For once, the decision was mine. Camille offered to connect me with a lawyer who specialized in domestic family cases. His name was Daniel Shaw. He called the next day. His voice was brisk, but not cold. He didn't ask for details right away. He asked how I was doing. It caught me off guard. I said I didn't know. He said that was okay. He asked me to meet in person if I felt up to it, so Amanda drove me to his office downtown. It was small, tucked between a bakery and a dry cleaner, but inside it smelled like lemon oil and fresh paper. Daniel reviewed my folder in silence. "The photos," the medical forms, the written timeline Amanda had helped me organize. When he finished, he closed the folder slowly. "This isn't a family spat," he said. "This is felony-level abuse." I felt my breath catch. I'd known it, but hearing it out loud was like stepping off a cliff. "What happens if I file?" I asked. "You'll be asked to give a formal statement. Then we'll submit everything to the district attorney. There may be an investigation. If charges are filed, there'll be a hearing, maybe a trial. Your sister will be notified. She'll have the chance to defend herself. But the evidence speaks loudly." I nodded, still holding my breath. "I don't want revenge," I said. "I just want it on record. I want it to be real in the eyes of someone else." Daniel leaned forward. "That's exactly what this does. It says you're not imagining it. It says your pain matters." The next step was filing the report. Amanda took me to the station. I wore gloves over my healing fingers. I told the officer everything, every word, every action, every second on that porch. He didn't interrupt. He didn't doubt. He just listened, typed, and asked for clarification when needed. When he was done, he asked, "Would you like to press charges?" My mouth went dry. My whole life I'd been told to keep the peace, to protect the family, to bury the pain. But now I looked at Amanda. I thought about the night air, the locked door, the smile that disappeared behind the curtain. "Yes," I said. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had opened my own door. Filing the police report was just the beginning. Once the official paperwork was submitted, Daniel moved quickly. He filed for a temporary restraining order citing physical endangerment and emotional harm. Within 2 days, it was approved. Rachel was legally prohibited from coming within 100 yards of me or contacting me in any form. Amanda printed the document and taped a copy to her refrigerator like a protective charm. I stared at it every morning, reading my own name as if it belonged to someone else, someone brave. But courage didn't come all at once. It came in small pieces like fragments of light breaking through a long winter. Each phone call from Daniel, each signed affidavit, each day I woke up and didn't check my phone. In fear was a tiny victory. Daniel warned me early on that Rachel's response wouldn't be passive. When people who've held power lose control, they often get louder before they go quiet, he said. Be ready. I was. I just didn't expect it to start with our mother. 2 days after the restraining order was served, I received a voicemail from Mom. Her voice was tight, almost brittle. Emily, I just got a call from Rachel. She's hysterical. What are you doing? This is family. We don't go to the police. Call me back. I didn't. She sent a text next, then another. The final one simply said, You're breaking this family apart. I sat on Amanda's couch phone in hand and felt the familiar ache of misplaced guilt. But this time, I didn't let it take root. Rachel had already broken the family. I was just refusing to pretend it wasn't fractured. A week later, Daniel called to say that the DA was reviewing the case and preparing charges. Rachel's attorney had submitted a letter denying all wrongdoing and claiming I had a history of exaggeration. They'll try to make this look like a sibling spat, he warned. It's not. You know that. We have proof. Stick to the truth. I spent hours preparing. Daniel walked me through every likely question. Amanda helped me rehearse my statement playing devil's advocate, asking the hard questions with a gentleness only a true friend could manage. I printed every document, every receipt, every timeline entry. I kept the photos in a separate folder labeled Evidence in all caps. One night, I stood in the bathroom mirror and said the words out loud. My sister locked me outside in freezing temperatures. I sustained frostbite and lasting nerve damage. I have medical documentation and eyewitness testimony. I said it again and again until my voice no longer trembled. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for February. When the day came, I dressed in a navy blue blazer and a pale gray blouse. Simple, neutral, strong. Amanda drove me downtown and waited outside the courtroom while I sat beside Daniel at the front. Rachel arrived late wearing all black and sunglasses even though it was overcast. Her attorney looked smug. She looked bored. Our mother wasn't there. I told myself I didn't care, but I did. The judge, a tall woman with a clipped tone and sharp eyes, reviewed the complaint. Daniel presented the evidence photos, medical reports, the police report, my written statement. When he showed the image of my hands taken 2 hours after the incident, Rachel finally reacted. Her face cracked for a split second, not with remorse, but recognition. She knew she couldn't spin that picture, not even with the best lie. Her lawyer objected to the phrasing Daniel used, claiming it implied intent. The judge overruled. Rachel sat rigid in her seat, lips pressed thin. When I took the stand, my heart pounded, but I didn't falter. I told the truth plainly. I didn't embellish. I didn't dramatize. I just described what happened, how I'd screamed, how she smiled, how the porch light went out, and how I thought I might die. I ended with the words I had rehearsed for weeks. She knew what she was doing, and she didn't care. When the judge adjourned, she announced a formal trial would be scheduled. Rachel would face charges of domestic endangerment and intentional harm. We left the courthouse in silence, Amanda's hand on my shoulder. I had struck back not with fists, but with facts, and the battle had truly begun. The trial didn't come quickly. Weeks passed, winter lingered. Snow hardened into ice, and so did my resolve. During that time, Rachel went silent. No more voicemails, no more sudden appearances. But I knew from Daniel's updates that her attorney was working hard behind the scenes, submitting character references, attempting mediation, floating settlements. They wanted to avoid court, to erase the paper trail with a quiet compromise. I refused. This isn't about money, I told Daniel. It's about truth. When the court date finally arrived, it was mid-March. I stood in the hallway outside the courtroom, arms crossed over my chest, listening to the hum of quiet conversations and shuffling papers. Amanda sat beside me, scrolling through her phone, pretending to be calm for my sake. But we both felt it, the weight of what was coming. Inside, Rachel waited with her lawyer. Her face was carefully blank, but I could read the signs: tight jaw, shallow breaths, eyes flicking around the room like she was looking for an exit. Mom wasn't there. Again. The trial was brief. Daniel called the urgent care physician to testify. He explained the nature of the injuries, second-degree frostbite risk of nerve damage, emotional trauma. Then came the photos projected onto a screen in the courtroom. My hands, my feet, my face red and chapped from the cold. The room fell silent as the images filled the space. No one spoke. Even the judge leaned slightly forward. Rachel's attorney tried to object to the photos being labeled as evidence of abuse. She went outside willingly, he said. Daniel stood, for less than 30 seconds, and she didn't lock the door behind her. The objection was overruled. When Rachel took the stand, she tried to play it down. It was a fight, she said. Emily was being dramatic, yelling, slamming doors. I told her to take a walk. I didn't mean for her to stay out long. Her voice wavered, but only slightly. She was composed just enough to look controlled, not enough to seem kind. Daniel asked her if she remembered smiling at me through the glass. She paused. I don't remember that, she said. I was upset. Upset enough to leave your sister outside in below-zero temperatures. I didn't think it was that cold, she answered. The courtroom murmured. The judge raised her hand for silence. You live in Minnesota? Daniel said. You know what winter feels like. Rachel didn't respond. After closing statements, the judge took only 20 minutes to deliver a verdict. She found Rachel guilty of domestic endangerment and willful neglect. The sentencing wasn't jail time, but it was public. Rachel was ordered to complete 200 hours of community service and attend court-mandated anger management therapy. More importantly, the restraining order was extended to 3 years, and her actions were entered into public record. She couldn't erase it. She couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. And that, in the end, was the real sentence. Rachel didn't look at me as the verdict was read. She didn't speak. Her lawyer muttered something under his breath and gathered their documents quickly. I stayed seated. I wanted to absorb the moment. After years of being dismissed, minimized, erased, this was the sound of acknowledgement. Outside the courthouse, Amanda hugged me tightly. You did it, she whispered. You really did it. I didn't want revenge, I said, voice thick. I just wanted them to stop calling it nothing. She pulled back and looked me straight in the eye. And now they can't. That night, I went home to Amanda's apartment and opened my folder of evidence one last time. I looked at the pictures, the reports, the statement I had read in court. Then I closed it. I didn't need to carry it anymore. The system had. The law had. And Rachel finally had been forced to carry something too. The consequences of her own choices. The silence that followed the verdict felt different. Not the heavy, suffocating kind I'd grown up with where words were swallowed and glances became weapons. This silence was gentle, almost tender. A pause in which I could finally breathe without bracing for impact. Amanda and I celebrated in our quiet way. She brought home takeout from our favorite Thai place, and we ate on the couch with our feet tucked under blankets while a cheesy romantic comedy played in the background. I didn't cry that night. I didn't even feel the rush of triumph I expected. What I felt was steadiness, a calm, like still water after a long storm. The next morning, I slept in for the first time in months. No early appointments, no fear of who might be outside my door. Just the soft light of spring melting into the windows, the sound of birds waking the world. My hands were still healing. There was numbness at the tips, a slight tightness in my joints, but it no longer scared me. It reminded me of what I'd lived through and what I'd chosen not to live with any longer. Over the next few weeks, I made decisions not out of fear, but out of freedom. I found a one-bedroom apartment close to the library where I worked. The kitchen had outdated linoleum, and the radiator made strange noises at night, but it was mine. I painted the bedroom walls a pale green and hung up new curtains. I planted herbs in small pots by the windowsill. Every act of nesting, however small, felt like stitching myself back together. I returned to work slowly, starting with half days. My coworkers didn't ask questions. They just welcomed me back with gentle smiles and quiet respect. Even my manager, who was usually all business, gave me a small nod and said, "Glad you're okay." That meant more than I could say. I also kept going to therapy. Not because I was falling apart, but because I wasn't. Because I wanted to understand the parts of me that still carried shame, the parts that had internalized Rachel's voice for so long, they sometimes echoed even in silence. My therapist helped me see that healing wasn't a destination. It was a practice, a choice I'd have to make every day, sometimes more than once. One afternoon, Amanda and I walked past a bookstore that had a sign in the window, seeking submissions for essays on family survival. She nudged me. "That's you," she said. I laughed it off. But later that night, I opened a new document and wrote the title, "The Winter She Locked the Door." I didn't know where the piece would end up, but writing it felt like reclaiming the narrative Rachel had tried to own for so long. It wasn't about blaming or even exposing her anymore. It was about freeing myself. And surprisingly, it helped. I stopped waking up with panic in my chest. I stopped flinching at every loud sound. I stopped second-guessing whether what I had experienced counted as real abuse. I knew it did. The court knew it. And most importantly, I knew it. One day, I received a letter forwarded to me through Daniel's office. It was from my mother, short, stiff. It didn't mention the trial, didn't mention Rachel, just said she hoped I was settling in somewhere. I folded it neatly and placed it in a drawer. I didn't cry. I didn't respond. I had made peace with the fact that some people confuse silence with love, and I wasn't going to keep trying to decode their language. Instead, I focused on the life I was building. I hosted Amanda for dinner. I donated the coat I had worn that night to a shelter. I bought a second-hand record player and rediscovered music I hadn't listened to in years. Every small step felt like a declaration I'm still here. I still matter. The frostbite scars on my fingers faded to faint marks barely visible unless you looked closely. But I knew they were there, not as wounds, but as proof. Proof that I had survived. Proof that I had chosen to stand up when silence had once felt safer. And with each passing day, I came back to myself more fully no longer. Rachel's sister, no longer the girl behind the door, but Emily whole and awake. It took nearly a year before I stopped thinking of the front porch as a threat. Even after I moved into my apartment and created a new rhythm, mornings with tea, evenings with books, weekends with quiet errands and fresh air, there were moments when the memory would press in without warning. A breeze through the window would feel too cold. The sound of a door closing behind me would make my shoulders tighten. But over time, the fear softened. Not because I forgot, but because I remembered differently. I had control now. That was the difference. That fall, I was invited to speak at a local support group for survivors of domestic and family abuse. Amanda had submitted my essay to a nonprofit without telling me. When they emailed to ask if I'd share my story in person, my first instinct was to say no. But then I thought of all the nights I had wished someone had said, "This isn't normal. You're not overreacting. You deserve better." So I said yes. I stood in a circle of folding chairs at a community center on a rainy Tuesday evening and told my story, not as a victim, not as a spectacle, but as someone who had been silenced and learned to speak again. When I described that night on the porch, I saw faces tighten. When I spoke about the trial, some nodded. When I said the words, "You don't have to wait for someone else to validate your pain," a woman across from me began to cry. After the meeting, people stayed behind to talk. They shared pieces of their own lives, stories of sisters, mothers, spouses, silence, shame, and survival. One woman said, "You gave me the words I didn't know I needed." I drove home that night through misty streets, the headlights reflecting off the wet pavement like fragments of a shattered past. But I wasn't carrying the weight alone anymore. The next morning, I took down the manila folder labeled Evidence. I went through it page by page, photos, doctor notes, court documents. I scanned the most important ones into my computer and stored the originals in a fireproof box, not out of fear, but because truth deserves to be preserved. I labeled it Legacy. That was what it had become. Not a wound. A warning, a record, a reminder. I didn't know if I'd ever speak to my mother again. Rachel had moved out of state, according to Amanda, and was reportedly working part-time under a different name. I didn't follow her, didn't stalk her online, didn't try to force closure. I no longer needed her absence to explain my strength. One afternoon, while reorganizing my bookshelf, I found an old photo tucked between two novels. It was of Rachel and me, maybe ages 6 and 9. We were building a snowman. I stared at it for a long time, searching for signs of what would come. There were none. Just two girls in puffy coats, cheeks, red eyes squinting against the sun. I almost threw it away. Then I didn't. I placed it in a new envelope, sealed it, and labeled it Then. Because that's where it belonged in the past, boxed and contained. Not erased, but no longer in control. I closed the door to that part of my life with the kind of finality that doesn't require an announcement. No ceremony, just choice. Every day that followed was ordinary, and that was its own kind of miracle. I smiled more, laughed easier, took walks just because the leaves were changing. I cooked for myself, wrote letters, let people love me in quiet, steady ways. And most importantly, I loved myself back, fully, fiercely, finally. The cycle didn't break in one moment. It broke in 1,000 little choices to stay, to speak, to testify, to walk away. And it stayed broken because I decided to live like I mattered. That winter, when the first snow fell, I stood at my own front door, wrapped in a thick coat and scarf, and I watched it in silence. I let the cold touch my face just for a second. Then I smiled, stepped back inside, and locked the door this time from the inside.